AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have a very interesting guest. His name is Stephen Mercado. He's a retired CIA officer from CIA's open source enterprise, formerly known as the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, FBIS. He now works as a translator and writer with a focus on Japanese diplomatic and intelligence history. In addition to the book that we're going to discuss today, he has written a number of articles and book reviews on both Asian and open source intelligence. He's got a brand new book out. It's entitled Japanese Spy Gear and Special Weapons. Stephen, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Stephen, what motivated you to write this book, and why now?
Well, in 2002, I'd written a book on the Japanese School for Intelligence Officers and Commandos, the Nakano School. And in that book, I had mentioned their close relationship with that part of the Japanese Army that researched, developed, and produced spy gear and special weapons. And I thought at the time of writing my first book that I really would like to go back and do a full treatment of this research institute, the Noborito Research Institute. So I eventually got around to it after finishing my career, 20 plus years after writing the first book. And so now here I am with the second book about Noborito.
And tell our viewers just a little bit about some of the resources that you were able to access in order to translate and write the book.
Yes. Well, first let me tell you what I couldn't access, which is government documents, because the Japanese Army at the time of surrender had about a 2-week window before the arrival of U.S. occupation troops. So there's not much written record from the Japanese government. They did a very thorough job of burning everything. And so what I have used are Japanese memoirs from some of the players involved. And in addition to that, there are reports generated by a museum that is dedicated to the Noborito Research Institute. They put out some really fine work. And then, of course, there's U.S. government documents which primarily cover the balloon bombing of the United States by the Japanese using bombs developed at Noborito. So there is some paper trail on the U.S. side, but mainly as it affects us as the bombs came to the United States, we can see what the U.S. was doing. So I was able to get these sources from the Library of Congress, from the National Diet Library in Japan, which is the Japanese equivalent, some other Japanese libraries and bookstores. And with that, I was able to put together something of a view of the institute. But there are many gaps.
Tell our audience what caused the Japanese to develop the facility at Noborito.
Well, it looks like the Japanese were a little surprised or concerned by developments in the First World War. Japan had joined the Allied side in the war and had fought the Germans in the Far East. But the scale of the fighting was relatively minor, certainly compared to what was going on the European battlefields. And so from their position, they could see that the Europeans were using poison gas. They saw the development of tanks, the appearance of tanks on the battlefield, the advance in aircraft. And they had the sense, I think, that they needed to catch up. So in 1918, for example, there was a study of poison gas by a committee in Japan. And then the following year, the Army created a new research structure for its weapons, which eventually led to the development of a sub-branch or a laboratory within that structure for developing secret weapons for covert operations and special weapons. And then that eventually leads to the need for more space as they develop their weapons. And so they went out and they acquired some land about 45 minutes by train southwest of Tokyo, and where it was secluded and the conditions were good for doing their research. And this was at a place called Noborito. So there they set up an institute that would do various things that were unconventional. I should say first that the Army, when it set up its modernized research structure, it had 10 research institutes for the development of technology. And only one of them, the 9th Army Technical Research Institute at Noborito, only this one was under the administration of what was called 8th Section of 2nd Bureau. 2nd Bureau is intelligence in the Army, as it is in many armies around the world. So 2nd Bureau, 8th Section was involved in covert operations. So from the start, this was an institute not for conventional weapons, but more for the special ones, and also to give operatives and intelligence officers the tools they need to do their work.
Some idea of some of the capabilities that were developed at Noborito.
Yes, at Noborito, they set up several sections, and in each section, they were focusing on different things. There was first section, for example, where they were working on projects such as a death ray. There was second section, which was involved for the most part in the development of poisons and other biological weapons for use in special operations. And then there was third section, which was the counterfeiting section. This was created to develop, fake currencies and forged documents that would be needed in agent operations. And then finally, there was a fourth section where the equipment was tested, developed, and training took place to show intelligence officers and operatives how to use it. So you have those four sections and a large variety of projects going on.
Jeff, where poisons were used?
Well, there was a case in 1941, for example, where Noborito officers went out to Nanking, which was then under Japanese occupation, and at Nanking, cooperating with other Japanese Army officers in the field in China, they did widespread testing on Chinese prisoners. And this involved everything from poisons to using microbes and other things like that. Among them, they were testing poisons that would have a delayed reaction. And this is important for special operations, because it's one thing to poison your enemy, but if you can poison the enemy and then the enemy doesn't die for, say, hours or a day or two, that obscures perhaps the hand of the poisoner. You can perhaps get away with the poisoning and nobody will know exactly who did it, or that perhaps the victim was even poisoned at all. So this was part of the testing being done in Nanking. It's very hard to prove where Noborito's products are being used, but there's a case in 1943 where a Chinese security official in the regime in China, the WWII regime, which was under Japanese sponsorship, this one particular officer named Li was part of the security apparatus protecting Wang, the regime, from nationalists, communists, and other enemies. And at one point in 1943, he ran afoul of his own leadership, and also certain people who had backed him in the Japanese army were transferred elsewhere, so he was without protection. And at that point, the Japanese decided to eliminate him. So a Kempeitai officer invited him to dine. He offered him a variety of food and insisted that he try the meat pie, which perhaps was where the poison was hidden. And Li didn't die that night, but I think he died the next morning. He was very sick the next morning and either died that day or the next day. So he was a victim of one of these delayed poisons that was a specialty at Noborito. And it's not certain that was a Noborito product, but circumstantially, it's quite possible that it was. And then there's one other thing, too, in 1943 that's very interesting, but it's not conclusive, which is that one of the Noborito officers sent a report on drug experiments, poisons and such, that had been conducted at Noborito, and he sent it to a counterintelligence officer of the Kempeitai who was in a shadowy organization called the Yama Agency, which was responsible for domestic counterintelligence in Japan. And so the question is, well, why did this domestic counterintelligence officer want to know about poisons and drugs being developed in Noborito? And the speculation on the part of one of the historians who follows Noborito in Japan is that this indicates an interest, at least an interest on the part of Japanese counterintelligence, army counterintelligence, and perhaps even the use of Noborito poisons and drugs within Japan to counter dissidents and threats to the government. So these things bring up, these documents and this evidence brings up interesting conjecture, but cannot be proven for sure. But we do know that they were working on these things, everything from this delayed poison to they were doing snake venom and all sorts of things that could be possibly used in operations.
Where were Noborito counterfeit operations most successful?
Well, the counterfeiting was essentially for China. After 1937, with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan was committing large forces to attack, invade China and try to bring China under control. In 1931, the Japanese had taken over Manchuria, which was basically part of China. And the goal was to control the rest of China. And after 1937, they found that they could fight and they could win battles, but China was so vast, so very large that they did not have the resources they wished to commit to taking over the entire country. So when the Chinese capital in Nanking fell, for example, they thought that would be the end of the war, but the nationalists simply retreated west and set up a new capital in distant Chongqing. So not willing to commit all their army to China because they were saving their best units for what they assumed would be a war coming against the Soviet Union, the army hit upon the idea that if they could destroy the Chinese economy, then they could end Chinese resistance. And the solution they came up with was, well, let's counterfeit the banknotes. We'll flood the economy with bogus banknotes. Inflation will explode, and the economy will come to its knees, and the basis for resistance will be ended. So that was the basis for setting up the counterfeiting operation in Noborito. And they went through, a number of trials. They brought in people from the people who did the Japanese printing of currency in Tokyo came in to help. They were very fortunate when Hong Kong fell. They were able to actually seize actual printing presses that made Chinese banknotes that they found in Hong Kong. And so eventually they came to develop banknotes that were basically indistinguishable from real notes. And they worked very well. The Japanese couriered the banknotes using operatives from the Nakano School. They sent the banknotes to China, from where they spread it through the economy. And so they were introducing the funds that way. And also another benefit of it was that the Japanese were able to procure what they needed in China, metals, food, and the rest, by using not real money, but by using their bogus currency. So it was a twofer, as they say. It was killing two birds with one stone. And so, for example, when they launched the massive drive late in the war, the Ichigo campaign, to go west and neutralize the American airfields, they spent a lot of the money they spent was using the bogus currency. So it was fueling inflation and was also serving as a way to procure what they needed. So that was the primary place where they were using counterfeit currency. The other place was they were also reproducing rupees, because they were sending agents into British India. And as part of that, they would send them in with bogus rupee banknotes. So that was the other place where they were working to achieve their goals through counterfeiting. And as for the American dollar, they were doing research on the American dollar. And I think by the end of the war, they had done some trial introduction of US dollars in Macau to see how it was going. But they found the dollar tough going technically. And they also said, well, even if they had developed it, there would be no way really to introduce it into the United States, right? The US was so distant. How would they actually get it into the US economy? So the war ended without any particular wins with the US dollar, but with the Chinese banknotes and for rupees, they were actually doing it actively.
Describe in some detail the balloon program, how they were developed, how they were launched, and what the impact was in the United States.
Yes. Well, the balloon program is probably the most well-known in the United States, since it was a weapon that attacked continental United States. Essentially, the Japanese realized, particularly after their losses at the Battle of Midway, that there was no conventional way to attack the United States. And there's no way to bomb the continental United States. They couldn't send their carriers west after that. Their first response was to launch a program to develop a super bomber. The idea was that bombers would fly from Japan, bomb targets in the United States, and then fly to German-occupied France, where they would be refitted with more bombs and fuel, and they would fly home to Japan, bombing the United States on the way back. This would require a bomber far larger than anything that had been developed at that time. So they realized, having launched the program, that they didn't have the resources or the time to actually develop a bomber. So without any conventional means to hit the United States, they came up with an unconventional weapon, which was a balloon. They tried a couple kinds of balloons. The most effective one turned out to be a balloon 10 meters in diameter, made of Japanese traditional paper and a paste made from a Japanese food called konjac, which you'll find on many Japanese dining tables. So using paper and paste, they put together these 10-meter balloons, and then to the balloon they attached a circular, like a mechanism from which they hung bombs and ballast, sandbags. And they had a mechanism where the balloon would drop the sandbags at some point in time to keep the balloon stable in altitude as it went across the Pacific on the jet stream. And then at a point where it's calculated that the balloon should be over the United States, the bombs would drop. So the bombs were created to carry a biological weapons payload, right? Because balloons by themselves really have no steering mechanism. And so the bombs that they did drop, which were explosives and incendiary bombs, really couldn't do much in terms of inflicting devastation on the United States. But balloons that would drop, for example, they had developed cattle plague. Balloons that would drop cattle plague in the West didn't actually have to hit a pinpoint target, but there's the possibility that it would spread to America's cattle herds, damaging America's food supply. They were also working on hog cholera, smut for wheat, things like that. They were successful. Certainly they were successful in the cattle plague. That's been written about by the Japanese themselves, by people involved. And there's some possibility, I suppose, that they could have been successful with the hog cholera, which was being developed at the same institute in Korea, where the cattle plague was successfully turned into a weapon. So although they had these weapons at the end, before the launch, the army, the higher-ups nixed it. And supposedly, General Tojo himself rejected the idea at the end, reportedly for fear that the U.S. would do something similar with Japan's rice crop. So instead of launching biological payloads, they put together these conventional weapons. Now, why do it if you can't bring America to its knees with these relatively small bombs on the vastness of the U.S. continent? Well, the idea was, at this point, it would be a psychological operation. Americans would hear about, or they would read in the press, stories of forest fires set off by bombs exploding in random places. Maybe some people would be hit by the bombs, and this would cause panic and would deliver a psychological blow to the United States and a propaganda victory for the Japanese. Unfortunately for the Japanese, after some initial brief reporting that bombs had been discovered in the U.S., the balloons had been discovered, the U.S. government put blanket censorship on this, and the Canadians cooperated, so they did too. And so the Japanese really didn't hear much about the program, and so they really couldn't gauge what was happening. And so this was a problem both for propaganda, and it was also a problem too, because the other thing with getting media reports on the balloon bombs is that the Japanese would be able to perhaps use the data to improve and develop their program, improve the weapon. So they weren't getting the data for propaganda purposes or for technical development. It looks like the program, I should say first, the balloons started going in November of 1944, and then they stopped in April of 1945. The story that the Japanese put out after the war was that this was because the Army, disappointed with the results, decided to end the program in the spring of 1945. What we can see now is that was a cover story or something to placate the Americans, because after all, under occupation, you don't want to tell them that you're actually preparing a second season, a second offensive that would start coinciding with the U.S. planned invasion of the Japanese home islands in November 1945, and that this second wave this time probably would have biological payloads. So that would have been a very different war. And American intelligence officials were deeply worried about this possibility that the second bombing season would be biological this time. So I think we would very well have dodged a bullet when the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945.
The Japanese surrender impact both the projects and personnel at Noborito?
Yes. So towards the end of the war, the Japanese were not preparing for surrender, but they were preparing for what they saw as the decisive battle. They expected that the Americans would invade the home islands and that they would extract such a cost in American lives that Washington would negotiate a surrender, because what the Japanese did not want was an unconditional surrender. They wanted to keep their system intact. They were afraid for the future of the imperial family, the imperial system of Japan. And so they wanted to come to some sort of a settlement with the Americans that would be gained by giving the Americans a real bloody nose when they invaded. And you can see what happened in Okinawa. Okinawa was a horribly costly invasion for the United States, and that was just one small island. So what they were doing was they were pulling back from the coast. They were relocating all other assets from places like Tokyo. The government, the imperial family, were being placed in the mountains of central Japan. And so were all the military assets. Factories were being moved, being placed underground in the mountains. The intelligence resources were being put there too, and including Noborito moved most of their facilities into branch sites in the hinterland, far from the coastal, big range of American coastal artillery firing from the ships. They wanted to be away from that. So they were preparing for the decisive battle. They were also deploying their assets to meet the Americans. And so in the Ryukyu chain, which includes Okinawa, they were sending operatives armed with pens that had bacteria in them. These were to foul the water supplies for the Americans when they landed. They were carrying explosives disguised in tubes of toothpaste, and they must have had some other things. One thing they did have, for example, they had Asian radio sets so that they could keep in contact with headquarters in the main islands. And in fact, after the surrender, even after the formal surrender in September of 1945 on board the USS Missouri, some of the Asians were still contacting Japan with their Asian sets. They were really, really well constructed and small radios that went to Okinawa.
What was the relationship between U.S. Army intelligence and staff members at Noborito?
Well, the staff at Noborito benefited from a decision that was made before the occupation to go in easy. MacArthur's staff was worried before the occupation that, as General Willoughby's G2 described it, there was such an imbalance of forces with this relatively few Americans going in at the beginning that it would be very dangerous to be punitive. If they went in kicking down doors and demanding information at the point of a gun, things could go very badly for the occupation. So the decision was made before the troops went in that the U.S. occupation forces would submit their requirements for intelligence through Japanese channels, that the Japanese would then supply the relevant personnel to answer the questions. So it was going to be civilized and not punitive. So for Noborito, what happened was, as with a lot of these personnel who were questioned by the Americans, they submitted, for example, an American unit would submit its request to G2, MacArthur's G2, and then a G2 was submitted to, for example, the Central Liaison Office of the Japanese government. Central Liaison would then pass it through officers who were Japanese intelligence officers during the war, in some cases, to the relevant Japanese, who would then come up to Tokyo for the interview. And then they would be accompanied by intelligence officers and coached prior to the interview about what they should and what they should not say. I'll just give you a couple names of some of the people involved. The final head of Japanese military intelligence in the war was Lieutenant General Arisue. And Arisue became head of something called the Arisue Agency, or Arisue Kikan, which was a group of mostly intelligence officers who were placed within the Japanese government to field these requests for information, for intelligence. And then one of the key people who was brokering this intelligence was a Lieutenant Colonel Nizuma. And Lieutenant Colonel Nizuma had been in charge or had been overseeing Noborito projects and other special research. For example, the research of Unit 731 of the Japanese Kwantung Army. Unit 731 is probably the most known Japanese unit involved in biological warfare during the war. So this Lieutenant Colonel Nizuma was overseeing all of this. So on August 15th, he was the one who had given the order the day of the Japanese surrender announcement. He immediately went out and ordered everyone to destroy all of their documents related to Noborito, related to the balloon bombing program, relating to Unit 731 and some other sensitive programs. And so then this Lieutenant Colonel Nizuma became a prime broker, and he would actually, in some cases, accompany Japanese officers to the U.S. interviews. And for example, there was an interview early in the occupation in which Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who was responsible for researching biological warfare, met with Colonel Nizuma, and the interpreter brought along was a Lieutenant Colonel Naito, who had been involved very deeply in the Japanese Army's biological warfare program, both with Unit 731 and also with Noborito. So Lieutenant Colonel Sanders went into the interview. He did not know that Nizuma was the one who had ordered the destruction of all the evidence. He did not know that Naito was anything more than an interpreter, just an officer who spoke English, how convenient. And basically, during the occupation, or at least the early parts of the occupation, when the Japanese were unsure how things would go, the Americans did not really get very much from their interviews. There was a lot of stonewalling. There was scripts. Basically, everyone decided what they were going to say before the interview. And it probably wasn't until after the U.S. Army gave assurances that there would be no prosecutions that a more productive relationship was established and data was exchanged with the Americans for other benefits. I should point out that in the Tokyo war crimes trials, people went on trial and several men were executed, including General Tojo, but not a single officer from Noborito, not a single officer from Unit 731 was ever tried for anything. So that gives you an idea of, one, the effectiveness of the initial cover-up, and two, the sort of the hidden but conjectured existence of a bargain that was struck later on.
U.S. occupation. What happened to projects personnel from Noborito?
Well, the most interesting thing that I was able to uncover was that some of the counterfeiters were hired by the U.S. Military to continue their work, but under the U.S. government. So at one point, the head of counterfeiting during the war, Colonel Yamamoto, was called in for questioning. He went to Lieutenant General Arisue ahead of time and said, "What should I do?" And Arisue said, "Well, at this point, tell them everything. There's no need to hide it at this point." So he went in and he revealed what the Japanese had done in counterfeiting, and the Americans were very impressed to hear this. And the upshot of it is that Colonel Yamamoto ended up working for the Americans. And then he went out and he recruited a number of his subordinates from his wartime operations. They set up shop under American administration or management at a former Japanese naval base called Yokosuka. I think many Americans are familiar with it because today it is a very large American naval base where many Americans are stationed. It's been there since the end of the war as a U.S. asset. So in this base, there was a small nondescript two-story building it went by the name of it was a General Procurement and Supply Office, something to that effect, GPSO. And in GPSO, you had American officers, some of them Japanese Americans, who were there to liaise in Japanese, and then General Yamamoto and his people. And it was a very good relationship. You know, there was a lot of respect from the American side. They didn't treat the Japanese badly. Yamamoto was called colonel or chief by the Americans working there. And one of Yamamoto's deputies, one of the Japanese, said, the nice thing about being there was, the pay was good, of course, but the Americans treated us as colleagues. We're fellow technicians, and they didn't treat us as a vanquished enemy. And so it was a good relationship. So that was one of the things that was going on. And at some point, the Americans decided to open up a second, or take some of the Japanese to a second workshop. And this was in California at a naval facility in San Bruno near San Francisco. And there they continued their operations into the second half of the 1960s. So it was quite a long career for some of them. As for the other ones, there's really not any paper trail that I was able to find, because although everybody was interviewed, I think, who was involved in Noborito, I think they all sat down and told the Americans to some extent what they had done. But knowing that the counterfeiters had actually found employment, you have to wonder who else found employment. I'll give you an example. In Korea, there had been a Noborito project that had taken place at the colonial, because it was a colony of Japan, the Colonial Livestock Hygiene Research Institute. This is where the cattle plague was developed. After the war, the Americans occupied Korea south of the 38th parallel, and they took over this livestock institute, and the Japanese, having been defeated, were leaving Korea. And so the Korean subordinates in the institute were promoted, and they became the managers of the post-war Livestock Institute. And this one subordinate, Kim Jong-hee, later claimed that the U.S. Army pitched him and basically said, "We'd like to take you and your colleagues back to the United States." I'm not sure for how long. And he rejected that. And in the end, actually, he went up and he defected to North Korea, where he may have set up a North Korean biological weapons program, because he actually did set up the North Korean Livestock Research Institute there. And knowing what he probably knew about cattle plague, could have been involved in a North Korean biological weapons program. But anyway, so hearing his claim that he was, invited to go to the U.S., you have to wonder how many of them actually perhaps did, either in Japan or in the U.S., did some further work. But again, there's no trail for that.
And how is Noborito remembered today in Japan?
Well, right after the war ended, some of the members of Noborito would get together for reunions at the New Year. And this is like people do all over the world. Veterans get together and they have annual reunions. They talk about the old days when they were young and all of this. And over time, these reunions, they coalesced. The different offices got together and they created a single organization for Noborito veterans called the Tokenkai. And one of the things the Tokenkai did was they started lobbying for a museum to remember their work. And the Noborito facility after the war had been taken over by a major Japanese university, Meiji University, which has its main campus in Tokyo. But they acquired Noborito for its agriculture faculty. And over time, they started taking down the buildings at Noborito as they got older, but one was left. This was one of the biological warfare buildings, and it was a relatively modern building built in concrete. And so it survived better than some of the wooden buildings that had been there for other purposes. So the upshot of that is that in 2010, a museum dedicated to Noborito was opened for the public. And here at the museum, it's a museum worth seeing, and it's not that far from Tokyo. There's 5 rooms, and you can go and you can see the history of Noborito. Each room has like a different focus: biological weapons, balloons, this and that. And you can go and you can see the history of the institute. And because of the institute's work, some of which, and they will admit it, was horrendous, or it was against international law. It was something that had to be done for the war, but it's not a source of pride per se. Yes, we made biological weapons, but it's a history that has to be faced. And so it's a wonderful thing, in my view, that the authorities at Meiji University and others got together and they created this they created this museum that shows you the history of Noborito without embellishment, without saying this was a wonderful thing, but just showing you what happened as it was, as history. So there's a good number of people who visit there. You can find it in TripAdvisor, for example. It's not unknown. The only thing for us in the United States is that there's very little English signage, which is, when you go to foreign museums, sometimes you may not see that much in English, but there is some. But just to see the panoramas, the things that the objects that they were able to put on display, things like that. It is very interesting. So Noborito is remembered today. I think it's the only museum in Japan devoted to an intelligence outfit. I don't think there's a museum of the Kempei Tai, for example. I don't think there's a museum to Unit 731. So it is very interesting for that reason alone. It's the only museum of its kind in Japan.
Well, the name of the book is Japanese Spy Gear and Special Weapons. It is a very interesting read. And I want to thank Stephen Mercado for a fascinating review.
Thank you very much for having me.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.